Before Victoria 3's release, and before I had access to play the game myself, I was rather outspoken on my dislike for the warfare system in the game. I was of the opinion that it would be the death of the game, with very few people sticking around to play more than a few campaigns, and that eventually the game would be shelved by the developers for lack of players. I tell you this to set my biases on the table, so you know where I stand as I tell you my final thoughts on this game, including whether or not my opinion has changed now that I've been able to put 70 hours playtime in. But first of all, let's talk of something different. When the game was very first announced, we were told of 4 game design pillars that Victoria 3 would be aiming to accomplish, that being national gardening, diplomatic eminence, everything is political, and era of change. And I think a good place to start with this review is to explore how well the game has done at living up to these design pillars. Building, shaping, tweaking, and evolving your nation is the first and foremost focus of the game. Events outside your country's borders can naturally affect your country in significant ways, but the game should never rely on war to provide the main source of enjoyment. I would argue that they nailed this pillar. The primary gameplay loop in Victoria 3 revolves around constructing and changing buildings within your nation to have them make you more money, and certainly this part of the game is fun for the most part. Seeing green line go up is something that is satisfying, especially when the game's prediction, which is most often quite incorrect, tells you otherwise. The way you construct these buildings is also a much improved system over Paradox's other games, as one must first invest in a construction sector, which employs pops and uses goods to construct the buildings you wish to build in your country. Depending on your economic laws, the cost you pay for construction can be heavily subsidized by an investment pool that is contributed to by various pops, but only certain buildings can make use of this funding. More on that in a bit. Early game, construction centers will use just wood and fabric and build very slowly, but later on, as you upgrade the production method to iron frame, then steel frame, and finally arc-welded buildings, the pace of construction speeds up considerably, as does the cost, as you add multiple goods to the production chain. Wood and fabric are plentiful and cheap in many countries, but when you start requiring tools, steel, glass, and explosives, the cost of construction can get overwhelming. It's not just the construction sector that can be upgraded with production methods either, and production methods in itself are, in my personal opinion, one of the best things about Victoria 3. A simple textile manufactory would, in Europa Universalis 4 or Victoria 2, be a building you construct and then forget about, as it just prints money for you without any attention required. In Victoria 3, however, you can start with building just the textile manufactory, and then later when you have access to the dye trade good, either through trade or building a dye plantation, you could and should change the production method to dye workshops, which will make more simple clothing that you can sell in your market. But it's not just a single production method per building. Taking the textile mill again, you can further upgrade it with sewing machines to include tools in the input. You can have your mill create just regular clothes, or you can change the production methods to craftsman sewing, which adds silk to the goods input to create luxury clothes. Later on in the game, you can even add electricity and rubber into the mix as you upgrade your mill to electric sewing machines, making clothes with elastics. It's truly one of the best systems in the game, and one of the areas most improved over its predecessor. War is a continuation of diplomacy, and everything that is achievable by war should also be achievable through diplomacy, even if that diplomacy sometimes comes at the point of a gun. This is a bit of a failure in the game, in my opinion, and I know this will be one of the more controversial takes I have. Diplomacy, in comparison to the building system, is very shallow. Each country has two elements of their relations with one another, attitude and relations. Relations is simple enough. It's a number between -100 and +100 that determines how much two countries like one another. Various diplomatic actions are locked behind how high or low this number is, and you can improve or damage relations at a rate of around 1 per month, or expel diplomats for an instant 30 hit to relations at a cost of 10 infamy. More on that in a bit. Declaring war cannot be done at all, and instead what you can do is start a diplomatic play, say to annex a state, or to open their market, or to make them a puppet. You can add multiple war goals in this play at a cost of additional infamy and maneuvers, the amount of which is determined by your diplomatic rank. Almost always, this diplomatic play will lead to war, unless your side has an absolutely overwhelming advantage in troop numbers, in which case the AI can submit to your first and only your first demand. While this play is ongoing, you can invite other nations to help you in your war at a cost of some maneuvers, things like war reparations, a state of their own, or even to give them some of your own land. Though bear in mind that a nation can abandon you if they feel you're adding too many war goals for yourself, as your infamy directly impacts your relations with all nations. The main reason why war is a continuation of diplomacy is a failure, though, is because all diplomacy stops instantly as soon as a war begins. It's impossible to add extra war goals after the war has started, nor is it possible to invite new countries to join you in your conflict. Considering we have historical precedents for both of these things occurring within the game's timeframe, its exclusion feels particularly jarring. The other half of diplomacy is attitude, which can range from antagonistic to loyal, and much more in between. This value affects how willing the AI are to enter certain diplomatic pacts with you quite heavily, and can be a great source of frustration when you have AI's relations up to the maximum possible, and yet because the AI is cautious, they will not enter a diplomatic pact or trade agreement with you. This is especially frustrating playing as one of the Italian states, as getting the other Italians to join your customs union is the path to forming Italy, and if the game randomly decides that, no, Sardinia-Piedmont is cautious of you, then your only recourse is to either start the game again or conquer territory from them, gaining you infamy that can, and likely will, make the other Italian states also cautious of you. Everything that is achievable by war should also be achievable through diplomacy is technically true, but also heavily based on RNG that the player has little control over, other than to restart the game and hope the RNG falls on their side this time. Politics is at the heart of Victoria 3, and all major features should in some way tie back to the pops and interest groups that form the core of the game's politics. If the construction of your industries and goods supply is the primary gameplay loop in Victoria 3, I would consider the political side to be the secondary loop. Your country has within it several interest groups, and all politically aware pops will support one. The amount of supporting pops and how politically relevant those pops are will determine how much clout each of these groups have. The landowners, for example, tend to be supported by wealthy aristocrats and clergy, whereas the rural folk tend to be supported by peasants and labourers. While there will be many, many more peasants in your country at the start of the game, each individual peasant pop will have much less political power than an individual aristocratic pop. I would say my only issue with the interest group system is that it seems a mite too easy to reform and introduce new interest groups into your government that have little power. You might ask why you would do such a thing in the first place, and the answer to that is that you may only pass a law if one of three things are true. If your ruler is in favour of the law, if there is a political movement for the law, or if one of the interest groups within your government is in favour of the law. But what are these laws? Within your politics, there are three groups of laws. Your power structure laws, which includes things like what sort of government you have, from monarchy to parliamentary republic, and how your country feels about religion, whether you have a state religion or total separation of church and state, to how the power is distributed in your country. Do you want to have an oligarchy? Should only the wealthy have votes? Or do you desire universal suffrage for all of your people? For your economy laws, you determine things like what kind of healthcare system you have, what trading policy you prefer, and whether your nation is a colonizer, and what economic system you have, from communist-style command economy to laissez-faire or interventionism. The economic system laws are the most impactful on your game, as they determine how large your investment pool is and what pops contribute to it, as well as which specific buildings your investment pool can be used for. For example, with the agrarianism law, the investment pool can be used to build agriculture and plantations, but not things like manufacturing industries or mines, whereas laissez-faire can help with manufacturing and mines, but not your agriculture. Finally, the third type of law is on human rights, where you get to determine if your nation allows slavery, the rights of women and children, and how free people's speech is allowed to be. To pass a different law, first either one of your interest groups you have as part of your government must be in favour of it, or your ruler must be in favour of it if you're a monarchy. From there you'll have a percentage chance of passing the law after a period of time, which is determined by both laws and how much authority you currently have. The more interest groups are in favour of a law, the more able you will be at passing it. However, interest groups can also be against certain laws, such as the rural folk being against colonialism, or your religious faction being against the separation of church and state. And if these groups get too unhappy, they can begin to brew a violent revolution against your rule, and force you to abandon the law you wish to pass. Other than laws and interest groups, you also have institutions like your healthcare system, law enforcement, education, and colonial affairs. These have a large cost in bureaucracy, but can have a large impact on your nation. The maximum level of these is determined by the various laws and inventions you have. They are relatively set and forget, though if you have a need for more bureaucratic capacity, you can lower these to compensate. I feel Paradox has done a fantastic job with this element of the game, as while there is an element of progress as the game goes on, it is viable, if difficult, to maintain an autocratic, isolationist slave empire if that's the path you wish to tread. Generally, no one law will be objectively better than another, as each has its upsides and downsides. A great example of this is the treatment of children in your nation. At the beginning of the game, most nations allow child labour, which increases the income of dependents, a subsection of POPs that includes disenfranchised women, children, the sick, and the elderly. And it has a cost of increased mortality in your farmers, labourers, machinists, and peasant POPs. If you restrict child labour, the income of your dependents will drop, but so too will the mortality rate. And if you implement compulsory primary school, the education institution will get further investment, allowing you to increase the level if you so desire. The Victorian era was a time of immense change politically, technologically, culturally, militarily, and socially, and these changes should be reflected in the experience of playing a campaign of Victoria 3. Yeah, the time between 1836 and 1936 in real life was a time of immense change. This was a time when countries rapidly industrialized and globalized, with many countries transitioning from being relatively self-sufficient to requiring global trade to survive. As a player, you'll be prepared for this shift in needs, as if you try to implement railroads in your nation without first acquiring a source of coal and steel, you'll have a pretty bad time. This is a time when slavery was abolished in the USA, and the springtime of the peoples, a massive political upheaval in 1848 which swept through Europe. Many countries had to deal with rebellions demanding democratic rights, removal of monarchs, and demanding independence. Many of these revolutions failed, but did have lasting effects that can be emulated in Victoria 3, like the abolition of serfdom that occurred in Austria, or the implementation of representative democracy in the Netherlands, or the end of the absolute monarchy in Denmark. While there is, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, no direct scripted trigger to have this revolutionary wave take place in the game, many of the individual aspects of it can be seen. Where this pillar fails, though, is militarily. And I think this is a pretty good place to start talking about the elephant in the room, the weakest part of this game. This is, without a doubt, the worst warfare system I've ever played in a Paradox game. I could leave my review of Warfare at that, and my review would have about as much depth as the Warfare system itself, but I shan't. Victoria 3 is not a wargame. That is very, very clear, and was clear throughout the development of the game. Even before the warfare was detailed in developer diaries, we had the pillars of the game stating that the game should not rely on warfare to be the primary source of fun, and that is a good and decent goal to aim for. However, in making warfare not the primary source of fun, the developers have made warfare be the primary source of boredom, the primary source of frustration, and the primary source for my complaints about the game. To explain why it's bad, I should first explain how it works in gameplay terms. To begin a war, you must first start a diplomatic play, say to conquer a state of land. After this period has played out, the sides are drawn and the war goals demanded. As long as one side does not back down, there will be war. Combat between armies is done on front lines, which span the entire length of a country's border with their enemy, to which you assign one or more generals. The troops that this general has under his command is determined by both their rank and how many available brigades there are in the barracks of the specific strategic region that they come from, And finally, you get to choose one of 3 specific things for your general to do with his men. You either advance, you defend, or your general and his men can go home and stand by. With advance, your army will attempt to seek out the enemy in battle, and if they're victorious, the front line will push forward by some amount of tiles. With defense, your army will sit and wait for the enemy to advance, though if both you and your enemy are choosing to defend, then no engagement will occur at all. Finally, with standby, your army will be able to reinforce any battle happening in their specific strategic region. You cannot assign a general to bring their army to another region to defend there with this, however. 3 options. 3 whole options is all you get with land-based warfare. With the Navy, you have a couple more options. You can defend your coastline, which will have the Navy hunt out and engage enemy fleets that maybe try to navally invade you. Hunt convoys, which will have your fleet sink enemy convoys over time, potentially reducing them to below the amount they need for their global trade network. Escort convoys, which will attempt to prevent your enemy from doing that, and naval invasion, which will take an army and land them on an enemy's coastline, potentially opening up a new front with which to fight on. You don't see any armies on the map. You only get 2 small pillboxes shooting at one another when a battle happens, and a UI so you can watch the ahistoric and frankly ludicrous casualty numbers tick up, with the amount of strategy you have in this system being limited to none. An argument I've seen quite a lot in defense of this awful system is that in contrast to previous Paradox games, Victoria 3's warfare will have less micro, and that is very important as you'll be so busy micromanaging your economy that you simply won't have time to pay attention to warfare. Not only is this a bad excuse if it were true, as if the economy were so fragile that it required constant, incessant tweaking to function correctly, it would not be a fun economic system to play with, but it's also just simply untrue. Front lines can split or merge over the course of a war, requiring you as the player to micromanage them, assigning generals to empty fronts, or in some cases putting generals back on fronts that they've somehow abandoned due to the clunky, buggy way that fronts function. It is the worst of both worlds, as it is neither fun to play, nor is it the abandonment of micro that some seem to find necessary. The warfare system does include a very basic logistics system, but it's so obtuse and incomprehensible that you'd be hard-pushed to ever make use of it, and seemingly it only comes into play by accident. The only part of this warfare system that, in my opinion, works well is the way that it links into the other systems of the game. Warfare is incredibly expensive, and going to war necessitates an increase in the amount of artillery, guns, and ammunition you require in your market. If you have shortages, your armies will have a much rougher time on the front lines. Also, the generals you appoint are characters in their own right, and as such are members of various interest groups, most often the armed forces interest group, but not always. And promoting them also gives their interest group a boost in political strength. However, while I'm not going to claim to know what a better warfare system is, these elements are also perfectly possible to have in a conventional Paradox warfare system. Neither of these elements would be out of place had, for example, Victoria 2's warfare system been updated and implemented instead of this abhorrent anti-fun mess. I do not need warfare to be the crux of the game, or to be the primary source of fun. Victoria 3 did not need to have a warfare system as deep as Hearts of Iron. It just needed a warfare system that was both competent and fun. And if it even tried to be that, it failed. In Victoria 2, each state only had as many resources in it as it had provinces, with each province having one resource available in it and one resource only. No matter how large the expanse of land is, or how fertile it was in real life, if that bit of land had a coal or an iron mine, you'd expect to see coal or iron in that province. With Victoria 3, each state can have multiple goods, and the amounts of each, instead of being determined by the total population of the state, are determined by the potentials of each good. For example, in the state of Limousin, there is a potential for 56 levels of coal mines, 15 levels of iron mines, and 8 levels of logging camps. This makes a huge difference over Victoria 2, which had Limousine have 3 provinces, netting you some grain, some livestock, and some fruit. Needless to say, Victoria 3 has 2 soundly beat in terms of realism here. It's not just natural resources that follow this pattern either, as each state will have a total amount of arable land, which is shared among the various agricultural buildings you construct. Taking Limousine again, it has 116 total arable land, and can only have wheat farms and livestock ranches there. Don't get too upset about the wheat farm either, as due to production methods, a wheat farm can be a vineyard or an orchard instead. Somewhere like Apulia in southern Italy does not have as much arable land at only 75, but is able to grow sugar and cotton. The system of state resources is one of the things I think is most heavily improved over Victoria 2, and I'd love to see it in more games going forward, as it's something I think the next Europa Universalis game could benefit from too. It's become somewhat of a meme in the Paradox community to have a go at the concept of mana, that being random, obscurely acquired magical points that have multiple uses that do not correspond to their generation. I believe the term was coined, at least in this Paradox context, to refer to the Monarch points in Europa Universalis 4, and when the capacities for Victoria 3 were first announced, much of the same griping was had about them being another form of mana. I can see where those complaints are coming from, though in practice I do think these capacities, which are not generated and stored like the mana in EU4, work pretty well. Think of it this way, if your bureaucratic capacity is at plus 50 for 2 weeks in a row, you will not have plus 100, but will instead stay at plus 50. Bureaucratic capacity is earned through the government administration building, and is used to govern your states, with each taking a certain amount depending on its population. It's also used for trade routes and various institutions. If you have an excess of bureaucracy, you'll make your construction sectors slightly more efficient, whereas if you do not have enough, you suffer from a tax waste. Authority capacity is earned through the various laws that you have. If you are a very authoritarian nation, you'll naturally have a bit more authority. You can use it to suppress or bolster the various interest groups in your nation, to add consumption taxes on various goods, and also state edicts such as the Greener Grass campaign to increase migration attraction to your state, or encouraging the various industries to get a boost to throughput in your manufacturing, agricultural, or resource gathering in the state. Having an excess means that you can pass laws faster, though in the negative the opposition interest groups, that being the groups that you do not have within your government, will get a penalty to their approval, making them more likely to start a rebellion. Your influence capacity is earned through how high ranked you are on the global stage, with great powers having much more influence, naturally, than minor powers. It's spent through the various diplomatic actions you can take with other nations, such as improving or decreasing relations, and also having nations within your customs union. Being positive increases the rate at which your infamy will decay, and being negative gives a penalty to your prestige, which is what determines your nation's rank on the world stage. And finally, there is your money. While you do have an income that will change daily based on various factors, and you can stockpile that money, you can only stockpile it to a certain level, after which there is an increasing inefficiency that quite effectively limits you from just hoarding unimaginable levels of wealth. The limit of this gold reserve is determined by your country's GDP, or to put it simpler, it's determined by the amount of goods your nation produces. The larger your economy, the larger the gold reserve limit. This works in the inverse too, with your credit limit, that being how much debt you can accrue, also being determined by this value. I very much like this system, as it encourages you to always have your economy be in balance. Originally, I was very much against the idea that goods would not be tangible on the market, and there would no longer be things like stockpiling goods. I thought this was especially strange for military goods, as stockpiling guns, ammunition, and canned food was a valid and utilised strategy in Victoria 2, and allowed you to fight at peak effectiveness sooner and for longer. However, after playing the game, my opinion has shifted, and I think this aspect of sell orders and buy orders is sufficient enough for the economic system to be healthy and robust, and not as prone to the catastrophic failures that Victoria 2 was. It's intuitive to understand and easy to manipulate, and that's exactly what you want in an economic system that's already quite enough complexity. One cannot just trade infinitely though, as you're limited both by the amount of bureaucratic capacity you have and also the amount of convoys. I was struggling with where to talk about this, because some elements of colonization I really do quite like. I like the fact that colonies start off with just owning a single tile inside of a state and slowly expanding, with the speed of expansion determined by your colonial institution and the level of malaria and your defences against it. But on the other hand, colonialism is far too easy, and too cheap, when almost every country is able to do it. The only cost associated with colonization is the bureaucratic cost of having a colonial institution in the first place, with it costing no money whatsoever to send your people halfway around the world to plant flags on other people's land. As Greece, a country that begins the game in pretty dire economic circumstances, it's no more difficult or expensive to colonize Sulawesi as it would be for Great Britain. Also, one might find this to be a positive or a negative depending on your opinion of scripted events happening, but there's no Berlin Conference event, no set piece where the great powers decide to carve up Africa, and because there is no hard-timed locks on certain technologies, the colonization and conquest of Africa never really looks like it did in our history. You'll never see a large Belgian Congo unless you're playing as Belgium, and somewhat strangely, Russia seems quite interested in conquering the Western Sahara. I'm not asking for 100% historically accurate colonial borders to be recreated, but a little more sense would not go amiss. Russia's desire for Western Sahara is caused by the same problem as Greek Sulawesi is. The fact that neither distance or cost seems to have any impact whatsoever. In Victoria 2, if you were a great power, and both yours and your target's economic policy allowed it, you could build factories and railroads in other nations. You could, with this system, force a country that was in your sphere to focus on a specific trade good, so that you didn't have to. This feature is sorely missing from Victoria 3, as there's no ability to build in anyone's territory but your own. On the one hand, I see how this feature could be abused. Railways are expensive to maintain, and your target country may not have the resources to run it properly. But all the same, there are ways around this that do not include losing the entire mechanic. There's not much to say here, other than it is incredibly limited. You can make other nations your puppet, and you'll get a decent amount of cash from it. It's worth doing if your economy is on the weaker side and you're confident of victory. However, if your new puppet's territory has a discoverable resource tag on it, then you're better off conquering the land for yourself, as the AI is really rather bad at building up their oil or rubber industries, which become incredibly vital in the late game, and you as the player can't build inside your vassals at all. Another reason you might want to vassalize a country in, for example, EU4, is because they have a bunch of lovely core territory on your enemy. So, say you're playing as Italy, you've unified the peninsula and you're looking for your next big challenge. So you puppet Greece, with the aim of going to war with the Ottomans and to return the Greek homeland to them. Well, you can't. You can't start a Diplo play on the behalf of your vassal, and there's also no way to sell or give territory to another nation. The only character that I've seen die at an appropriate age in this game has been King William Hanover, the father of Queen Victoria, as his death is scripted to happen at a certain time. Most other kings and rulers in this game live well into their 90s, with several being over 100 at their time of death. This is clearly a bit janky, but for the most part it's not a massive deal. However, there are certain areas that make it worse. For example, historically the ruler of Russia, Tsar Nikolai Romanov, ruled until 1855. He was and is in the game a traditionalist, and was not in favour of abolishing serfdom, which is what his son Alexander II did, as Alexander was a much more liberally minded man. In-game, Nikolai Romanov, who was born in 1796, can and often does live until 1900 without issue, and while you can absolutely abolish serfdom within a year of the game by reforming your government to include, for example, the industrialists, it doesn't exactly feel very sincere or authentic to the period to do so. Now, I know what you're thinking. But the map is beautiful, how can this be a negative? And it's quite simple. It's the damn zoom, and Paradox's recent trend of shying away from giving us actual map modes that we can select. I want to be able to see this paper map no matter how close I zoom into the game, and I want to be able to see the terrain no matter how far away I zoom. Instead, we have the worst of both worlds, where the change between is harsh and sits right at the point I personally like to play at, meaning the map is constantly shifting back and forth as I zoom in just slightly to be able to click on a state. Remove this silly automatic change and give me a couple of keyboard shortcuts to actually use the map as I want, not how the game incorrectly thinks I should want. And somewhat tangentially related to the map, this flag-based occupation system looks awful. This tiled flag thing, just get rid of it. It's really bad. It doesn't give you any extra information that striped lines did. It's just awful. As are these clouds. They are way too thick. They obscure visibility on the ground below. I hate the clouds and I can't wait for modders to get rid of them. I said at the start of this review that my opinion pre-release was that due to the game's awful warfare system, I felt the game would not succeed. And I think it really does hinge on the first big DLC and patch as to whether I'm right, because this is still an opinion I hold. The core gameplay loop is engaging, seeing line go up is definitely satisfying. But I'm not sure if it'll remain satisfying after your third or fourth campaign in the game. The lack of satisfying or even truly remotely competent warfare really hurts the game, and I feel that the first big update to the game needs to be some kind of overhaul to this system. I don't believe the game will have as heavy a presence on YouTube like, for example, Hearts of Iron does, as while it may be satisfying for the player to see their economy line go up, it's not really something that most will find terribly engaging to watch. And YouTube popularity really does impact on a game's popularity, as does the multiplayer scene, which I think will be dead in the water due to the lack of interesting warfare. The rest of the game is good, even great in parts, and I do enjoy the economic aspect of the game. I enjoy the politics, I think the pops are done very well. But this is a period that includes World War I. It should be the capstone to the game, the big set piece at the end where you can determine more than just what number is next to your country in the rankings, just how well you've done in the previous 80 or so years. A chance for you to test your country that you've built against the other countries of the world. And that capstone, it just doesn't exist.